What's up guys, it's Doublezug. So today we're going to be talking about the third boss in Heart of Fear, which is of course GARALON, this giant Starship Trooper looking bug creature here. This fight is a super fun healing encounter. It's going to be very testing on your mana management and your ability to do raw HPS. It's a relatively long encounter, around like the 6 to 7 minute mark probably for your first kill. And there's heavy rot damage and spiky damage from Crush, which is this mechanic that's just coming out here, where the boss will do this very obvious animation where he jumps up, and as soon as he lands, he'll do a big stun and big physical damage to the whole raid. So your ability to keep people topped to not die to this Crush is going to be very important here. Definitely like a 2 to 3 heal on 10 man, 5 to 6 heal on 25 man for your first kills. However, you can very quickly probably just drop to 2 to 4 in 10 and 25 man. I didn't see a huge difference in terms of difficulty between 10 and 25 man here. So this is not like the second boss where it's significantly harder on 10 man. Again, this mechanic, Crush here, is one of the like 2 to 3 dangerous healing mechanics. Very convenient that it has this super obvious animation. It makes timing things very easy. Especially important for things like Halo Cascade, things like Healing Tide Totem, things which are important to drop just before damage happens. Very easy, even if you don't have timers, which you obviously should have, like Fogies or DBM or whatever. Just being able to look at the boss's animation is going to tell you exactly when things are going to happen. It's kind of like a Dark Souls boss there. So that's the first dangerous healing mechanic, is going to be Crush. Obviously the second is going to be the ticking nature damage on the raid. The third is going to be this pheromone ability here, which you can see I have tracked on my raid frames with this this Fogi Weakora here. This is going to be passed between players. As a healer, you probably won't have to deal with this until maybe the end of the fight, where you run out of like range DPS or something. But this is like one of the most dangerous healing mechanics in the fight. This player is going to take pretty heavy damage, and they're going to be especially in danger when those Crushes come out and overlap. So keeping healing on this player, things like Hots, Earthshield, Riptide, Life Bloom. Although honestly, there's really two versions of this fight. There's the version of this fight where you have a Holy Paladin in the raid, and then there's hard mode. Because Holy Paladin with Beacon can pretty much solo this mechanic and make you completely able to just ignore it pretty much on all your other healers and just have Beacon solo it. Beacon has a very long range, it's castable at a very long range, so every time this is swapped over to a new player, you just swap your Beacon and it makes the fight 100 times easier. Whereas if you don't have a Holy Paladin in the raid, you might have to actually like do things run out to range them a lot on your healers, or just even hard assign a healer to babysit them, which is probably the best thing for progression, not the best thing for like kill times or parsing. But if you are struggling with this, you can just go up a healer, like go up to 6 healers or 3 healers in 10 man, and just have one of those healers completely babysit the pheromone person. So those are the 3 mechanics. You can see these Crushes go out quite regularly, like about every 30 seconds, I believe. The other thing, which is the like super important thing as a healer, is you never want to ever walk into this red targeting circle. You can see if you have the boss targeted, the red circle lines up completely with this less easily visible purple circle. So I'd recommend you just keep the boss targeted so you can see this circle a little bit better. If you ever enter this circle, you will trigger an extra crush on the boss. And while that is very good for your parse as a healer, it's not good for killing the boss. If we look at logs here, we see a very unsurprising result, which is that, a raw HPS fight is dominated by Holy Priests. Just the raw HPS gap between Holy Priest and every other healer is very wide, and so again, any fight where raw HPS matters, Holy Priest is going to be super dominant. 2 Mistweavers higher than like even the next Shaman, which is a little bit surprising. Mistweaver has a very, very high like HPS ceiling. If you played a specific way, I believe these players are probably going to be not doing too much fist weaving. Yeah, you can see here the Rankward Log only has 6% of their healing as Eminence, so not doing too much fist weaving, even with the damage amp on those legs, just focusing mostly on like Chi bursting into the raid stack and using Rem, Uplift, and Spinning Crane Kick, which is going to be Rushing Jade Wind, to just do big AoE healing. We also see a Soul of the Forest Vigil Resto Druid up very high here, again above even the highest Shaman, which is kind of cool. This fight is an incredible fight for snapshotting efflorescence, because generally speaking, if you position properly, the raid is going to be fully pixel stacked in the middle, which means that you can get a full giant efflo proc with all your CDs and Bloodlust up if you lust at the beginning, which I'm sure they did. Yeah, you can see they lusted at the beginning. He had Zerk up here, and that's when he snapshotted his efflorescence. and he never cast Bloom one time, and you can see Eflo is doing 26% of his healing. So this is an incredible fight for snapshotting, again, because you lost at the beginning and you never move. It's basically best case scenario. Also, you can see that his rejuvenation only did about 20% overhealing. So because your mushroom stores up overhealing on this ability, you aren't losing as much as in a fight where there's much less rot damage and much more spiky damage for not pressing your bloom here. So actually a really incredible resto druid fight as well. Shaman is similarly quite strong on this encounter because conductivity has a similar interaction that Eflo has, because you can healing rain on the stack and just never move it. Our top disc priest is only rank 52 here, doing like 171k HPS, which is still quite significant. We can see Megzi here on disc, and we're going to look at Megzi's like rank 2 log too. Both running Divine Star builds, focusing on Divine Starring into the raid stack. We can see the Holy Priest is 120k raw HPS ahead of the Disciplined Priest. However, the Disciplined Priest does generate significant absorbs, obviously generating like 30 million absorb over the course of this encounter is going to make those crushes safe. However, the crushes are not like going to one-shot you, so these absorbs aren't like as valuable as they would be on a spikier encounter, and this raw HPS is, you know, just super insane, and it's also going to make your raid very significantly safe, as well as things like Lightwell being able to like smart heal everyone's stunned. So definitely a Holy Priest angle, even with the damage amp. Alright, so quick intro there. Now I'm going to go through builds and talents and glyphs really quickly here, and then I'm going to end off with like a section talking about how to set up your healing for this encounter to be the most successful, because there is some like interesting stuff to be done there. So first of all, for Priest, first row doesn't matter, second row is always Feather. 45 row, I would play Solace on this encounter for both, although for Discipline, you could always play Mindbender if you're just a little bit more focused on that damage. However, I do think like with the damage amp on the legs, also Solace just being generally higher mana, I just usually play Solace. Also for Holy Priest, I just generically always pretty much play Solace as well, just because of the mana it gives, the damage being incredible, and also, you know, its interaction with Twist of Fate. For 60 row here, either is fine. Angular Bulwark's kind of nice because it will proc if you ever get super low on a crush while you're stunned and keep you from dying to like rot. However, Desperate Prayer is, you know, nice if you actually remember to press it. 75 row, always Twist of Fate. And 90 row, this is a big decision here, which I'll go into a little bit later when I talk about how to set up your healing for this with an actual healing comp. Generally speaking though, all the top parses are going to be running Divine Star and using Divine Star to heal the stack healing. But there's definitely situations where I would take Cascade or Halo, primarily Cascade for this encounter. Cascade having a much lower like ceiling in terms of raw HPS, but being very useful in this situation because of how Crush works and how it's timed, and the travel time of Cascade as well as the coverage on the raid. For glyphs, not super techy here, pretty much just take like Deep Wells. You might even take Circle of Healing here just to spend more of your mana on Smart Healing POH. And then for our third glyph, doesn't really matter too much. You could just take something like Inner Sanctum for that ticking damage. Again, for Discipline, also a pretty generic setup. You just want to take Penance. You don't necessarily need to move too much on this fight, but any fight where there's basically any movement at all, you always want this. You know, you're obviously not going to take Circle of Healing. You could take something like Glyph of Smite and Glyph of Holy Fire for some extra damage. I would definitely not take Prayer of Mending Glyph on this fight for either spec because it's a ticking damage fight, and losing that extra charge of Palm is not worth getting the extra like single target spike healing on Palm. And we can see when we look at logs, it's just exactly what I said, where all the top logs are going to be running D-Star on Holy and Discipline, and we have to go pretty far down to get a log that's not running D-Star. We can see the highest non-D-Star is going to be running Cascade. Next, we can talk about Monk here. For Monk, I just played Tigers last year, although this is a fight where you can't freedom anything, so you could potentially also play Momentum or Celerity if you just prefer those movement abilities. For a 30 row here, you definitely play Chi Burst for HPS on this encounter. If you want a mixture of damage and HPS, I'd actually play Zen Sphere here. You could put one Zen Sphere on yourself in the melee stack, one in the range stack, or both in the melee, and this will give you a better mixture of damage as well as healing, doing AoE healing, taking single target damage, which can proc on the legs, and then the explosion being able to cleave the legs and the boss. However, I think you probably will see most of the DPS parses running Chi Wave and all the HPS parses running Chi Burst. For 45 row, obviously Chi Bruise the Abyss, pretty much always. For 60 row, doesn't matter. 75 row, you probably want Diffuse or Dampen Harm. Dampen Harm is going to mitigate the damage from the Crush, whereas Diffuse Magic will mitigate all the rest of the damage. If we look at a damage breakdown of this encounter, we can see Pheromones is actually like 80% of the damage, whereas Crush, which is physical damage, is only going to be like 13%. So while it looks super dangerous, you shouldn't really be dying to this too much if the raid's topped, and Pheromone, mitigating this damage is going to be the most important in my view. So you probably do want to take just like diffuse. Also, if you're carrying the pheromone at any point, you can always like diffuse at high stacks, diffuse and like sit in the puddle and heal if you don't want to move. However, both of these options are just fine. Also, healing elixir is also pretty decent here. For our 90 row here, actually all three of these options are usable in my view. Chi Torpedo is really good on the stack, especially if you have like a hugely heavy ranged composition, especially in 25 man. I would basically never play Chi Torpedo in 10 man. But specifically in 25 man, if you have a very, very heavy ranged composition with a lot of people in the stack, and you also like don't have a lot of stack HUS, which is going to be very rare, right? You usually have a Holy Priest, a Resto Shaman, etc. in the raid, doing all that healing more effectively than you can do with Chi Torpedo, in which case you want to run something like Rushing Jade Wind. You can run with the melee that are going to be chasing legs around, and this is going to do very effective healing on those players, also doing good damage, generating quite a bit of chi you can use to press uplift. For pure damage, I do think you probably just go Tiger, as you pretty much always do. And we can see that played out here. However, if we look at the top parses, the top Tiger parse is only like 10k DPS ahead of the top Rushing Jade Wind parse here. And we can see even the top Chi Burst parse is only like 1000 DPS below the next Chi Wave parse. So the most important thing for DPS on this encounter, if you are like DPS parsing on your monk, is just going to be getting a lot of value out of the leg amplification. And like cleaving onto the boss off the legs and stuff like that with your blackout kick. So that's really important, whereas your talent choice I don't think is super important. Also, the fight is like quite long, so the burst from your Joen that's like inside of Lust with all your procs is going to be less important here. Also, if we compare HPS and DPS across the two parses, we can see rank 1 damage parse is doing about 150k raw. We can see the damage done's like 100k, whereas the top healing parse did about 30k DPS. So we're losing like a little bit less than 1-to-1, right? We're losing 70k DPS for like about 100k raw HPS, but generally speaking, in my view, the way you wipe on this encounter is from a lack of healing, not from a lack of damage. So for speed killing and stuff like that, maybe you do take this opportunity to just purely like cleave off the legs and do max damage. However, I think for most guilds that are progressing this encounter, you definitely want to focus a little bit more on this raw HPS rather than damage. And that's going to look a lot more similar to how you played on Will if you didn't do the dance, where you're going to be focusing a lot less on things like jab. You can see CPM on jab only about 5 for the rank 1 HPS caster. Just tiger palming and blackout kicking when you have the opportunity, when the boss turns around, so you're in a favorable spot to hop into one of those legs and do some damage and keep your buffs up. But for the most part, you're going to be just keeping your Rushing Jade Wind up, generating chi with things like a Spell Harm that are super efficient, and then just spamming your uplifts and your rems onto the raid. Obviously, Thunder Focus T is really good here. You can kind of just TFT on CD. You can see that's what he did here, where 1.3 CPM on Thunder Focus T, that's basically on cooldown. For Paladin here, in 25 man, Paladin's actually like pretty low down on the list here. We can see the top HPS Paladin's only doing like 162k, so considerably behind playing the Selfless Healer build. We have the highest EF, just slightly a few thousand HPS behind at 157. However, the story is totally different in 10 man. If we look at 10 man healing, we can see Holy Paladin's like rank 3 here, very, very high up there with the Eternal Flame build, doing really well in 10 man, obviously just blanketing the whole raid. Also, however, this is missing what I mentioned before, which is that Holy Paladin is incredibly useful on this encounter, so you won't get the same raw output. So if you're like dropping healers super low on this encounter, Paladin is going to be not picking up as much slack. However, the access to that beacon just transforms the way you deal with this pheromone mechanic to such an extent that if you have the opportunity to flex a Holy Paladin in, if you have a Holy Paladin available in your healer core, it's just going to be hugely helpful in an outsized degree to like what you see on logs. When it comes to talent builds here, for movement stuff doesn't really matter because you shouldn't be moving too much. However, if you're chasing legs, which you probably shouldn't be, you could take Long Arm of the Lost and you're going to be judging on CD with Selfless Healer. But for non-Selfless Healer, you could just take either of these two. 30 row doesn't matter. For 45 row and 10 man, you're playing Eternal Flame, and 25 man, you're probably playing Selfless Healer. However, Eternal Flame is also very useful in 25 man for this encounter. You can spread your hots out on the melee and make them a little bit safer, given that they're not going to be in the big raid stack, which is going to be getting things like Divine Star and Healing Rain, means that your Eternal Flames are going to be doing much lower overhealing than they would be on most fights in 25 man. So Potential option to swap to Eternal Flame here in that 25 man. Also, Eternal Flame doing insane beacon healing is also great for keeping your Pheromone player alive. If you're a 60 row, I would just probably take Clemency for double bops, but these other two options are fine too. I'm unsure if Hand of Purity mitigates the ticking damage, but I don't think it's worth it to take, even if it does, over something like double bop, double hand sack. Unbreakable Spirit's good for your personal HPS, but I can just generally take Clemency. 75 is Holy Avenger, and 90 row is just going to be Light's Hammer. Holy Prism, on the beta, I heard that it was working off the damage amp from the legs, but I'm not sure if that's working on live. We can see the highest Holy Prism logs are significantly behind, and it is kind of an ideal Light's Hammer fight anyways, right? So I just default to this one for glyphs here. Basically just a standard setup. You want Beacon, you want Hand Sack for hand sack and crushes. You can hand sack the Pheromone target to keep them a lot safer. You can hand sack somebody, bop somebody. Very, very useful. Similar to what I've said in a lot of these fights, for your third glyph, you can either take a defensive option with your shield wall doing physical DR for those crushes. However, the 40% magic DR on the ticking damage is also quite useful, so I probably wouldn't take this. You can just take something like Glyph of Divinity or Glyph of Flash of Light for throughput. For Restoration Druid here, for 15 row, I'd probably take Displacer Beast. I just think having the MS here is not going to be great since you're not going to be like chasing the melee around too much, and having a blink so that you can instantly blink out to grab a pheromone off somebody or to range the pheromone player is really nice here. For 30 row, just always Ysera's Gift. 45 row doesn't matter. 60 row, Soul of the Forest is going to be a great take here. It's going to give you the highest like rot average HPS, and Incarn not great here, and Force of Nature is going to have a similar profile to Soul of the Forest, giving you just like rot over time with a tree every 20 seconds. Also like the F-flow from this being on the rage stack is kind of good, but just lower HPS than Soul of the Forest, so I'd just default to Soul. For 75 row, doesn't matter, and for 90 row, Heart of the Wild is okay. The problem with Heart of the Wild is that this kill time you can see for progression, most of you are going to be killing this around the 6-minute mark, which means you're not going to be getting 2 uses out of your Heart of the Wild, which is a 6-minute cooldown. The ideal fight duration for Heart of the Wild is either incredibly short, so you get maximum uptime of your Heart of the Wild, or just over 6 minutes, ideally 6:45, so you get 45 seconds of this after the 6-minute mark. So those would be like the 2 ideal fight lengths, and this is kind of the perfect like bad fight length where, you unless you're killing it slowly, where you're killing it in like 7 minutes, in that situation, Heart of the Wild can be quite strong. But if you're killing it around the 6-minute mark, I would take Vigil. If your fight's longer than that, you could potentially take Heart of the Wild. Nature's Vigil is the same, where you just want to use this exactly on cooldown. And both of these are going to be quite strong and relatively close. You can see most of the top logs in 10 man are running Vigil, and in 25 man it's a little closer here. However, I think, Nature's Vigil is still better despite this representation. For Restoration Druid, our glyphs are like 100% locked in. We have F-Flow, Wild Growth, and then our third slot is a little bit more flexible, but at the current gear level with our low levels of crit, I would take Glyph of Regrowth pretty much all the time. For Shaman here, I would take Astral Shift on the first row just for like those crushes. However, Stone Bulwark Totem is actually quite good as well. It has a lower cooldown, so you can cover more crushes with this. Also, it's like super mana efficient, so it does show up on like logs. So if you want to parse cheese, you can take this as well. Nature's Guardian is also fine if you just don't like pressing your personals. For 30 row, it doesn't matter. For 45 row, I'd probably take Call of the Elements here just for the little bit of extra juice on having an extra HST. However, again, Totem Persistence is just fine. Projection, not hugely useful here. People are not generally going to be out of the range of your totems on this fight, although you can use it to like project a Spirit Link into melee or something. For 60 row here, I would just take Ellie Mastery, and for 75 row, there's a little bit of something here to say about rushing streams. You rushing streams and you move your healing rain around every 10 seconds to where the melee stack is, and you let something like a Holy Priest Divine Star into the raid stack to keep them topped, which could be overall like more healing efficient and lower overhealing. If you're 90 row here, Ellie Blast is really cool. I just like Ellie Blast, but maybe I'm crazy for that. I think Ellie Blast is probably overall like your highest HPS, but Primal Ellie is really cool here because you obviously get the damage from the Fire Ellie, and the 1 minute of 20% DR from the Earth Ellie is going to do a lot of like effective healing on you with all the ticking damage and all the crushes. And you can see from logs here that like basically everyone plays Primal Elementalist, with even Unleashed Fury having a higher pick rate than Ellie Blast, which I think is completely insane. In 10 man, it's going to look very similar as well. You can see 10 man exactly the same. I just think this is like very odd. I think Ellie Blast is like much better than a 1% pick rate. However, basically everybody just plays Ellie for the damage and the defensiveness on Earth Ellie, which is also qualitatively quite nice, but I do think like it's totally possible to get a very high HPS with Ellie Blast. Alright, so now that we've talked about builds and talents here, I want to very quickly go over like positioning and how to assign your healing to be effective on this fight. So if we see like this is the boss room, and let's say like the bug is going to be here, you're going to be kiting your pheromones around. Let's make the pheromones green. They're going to be going like around the edges here, so you're going to have your pheromone player out here with the debuff. They're taking damage. And then, of course, you have your ranged stack is going to be like here, centrally located next to the boss. Of course, you're going to have your melee like around chasing legs, so they're usually going to be kind of far away from the range stack. And then, of course, your tanks are going to be out here as well. So we have basically like 3 groups of players who need healing, right? We have the range stack, which is one group. We have the melee plus tanks, who are generally speaking going to be close enough to get like overlapping AoE and splash and smart healing. And then we have the pheromone player. So part of the reason why I said that HPAL is like so good in this encounter is because HPAL eliminates an entire group here. Just Beacon will solo this entire part of the fight, which means that we have a lot more attention and healing stuff to go into these 2 groups. So how do we set up healers here? Well, in 10-man, this is going to be a lot simpler because we only have 2 healers in the raid for the most part. If you go up to 3, you can have 1 healer do each job, which could be a simple way to do this, but maybe not the most efficient. Generally speaking, you're going to have the healer that has the most efficient stack healing take care of the ranged. This is usually going to look like your Resto Shaman, just putting rain down here, and then using their filler stuff, like, maybe keeping Earth Shield Riptide on here, and then their other 2 Riptides on the tanks, and then chain healing off the tanks into the melee. But you could just as easily have like a Resto Druid put Efflo here. You could have a Priest Divine Star into the raid. Divine Star is actually better than Healing Rain, especially in 25-man, so that's a potential option. And if you do choose to cover the range stack with something like a Divine Star, you can instead have your Resto Shaman move their rain with the melee, which is one of the reasons why, again, I said, like, rushing streams could be useful here, because if you're moving your rain all the time to keep it on the melee, you're not taking advantage of the conductivity extension as well. So this interaction of Priest versus Shaman is actually quite interesting, because in 25-man, you're definitely most likely going to have multiple Priests and potentially 1 or multiple Shamans. And so deciding whether or not you use D-Star or Rain to cover stacked healing is going to be a very important discussion, and doing both of these things is going to be super inefficient. So if you don't have Rain on the ranged, you want D-Star, and if you don't have D-Star, you want Rain. And so if you do choose to cover this with Rain, then what you want the Priest to do is, instead of using D-Star, you want the Priest to be using either Halo or Cascade. The thing with Cascade that's really nice is that you can cast Cascade, let's say, on the tank. It's going to bounce to the pheromone player and then bounce back into the stack. So it's going to cover every single group of players. And having like a 25-second cooldown means you can have it for every single crush. You can have a Cascade bouncing around. The travel time means you can also use it before the crush comes out, which is super effective. If you're going to be using Halo, I'd recommend positioning in such a way that you can Halo the melee and the ranged at max range. You probably are not going to be able to get the pheromone player, which is the big weakness of Halo on this fight. The pheromone player is kind of in danger, right? So you definitely want to have, if you're not running D-Star, you definitely want to have something that will hit the pheromone player. And positioning such that Halo is going to hit them means your Halo is probably not going to hit the other players as well. So I would generally either run D-Star or Cascade. So how do the other healers fit into this? Well, Druid can kind of do the same thing as a Healing Rain, putting their Efflo down on the stack, and that's very, very powerful because, again, of that snapshotting interaction. And so with your Efflo here covering things, you definitely want to be focusing on rejuving the melee, the tanks, and the, of course, Stinky Boy out here. You could even potentially roll Life Blooms on this player instead of on the tanks. And you can even focus on Wild Growthing into melee such that, it's 20 yards around your target. I'm generally trying to force that wild growth into the melee to cover the healing that's not being done by your Efflorescence. For Mistweaver, because you're probably going to be running Rushing Jade Wind, which is like around your player character, you could do something like keep your statue here and then have your player character over here so that you're going to be smart healing both the melee and the ranged. Alternatively, you could put your statue out here so that, the person who's stinky will be in the range of your statue, although this is going to require lots of micromanagement. It's constantly having to move your statue around to get range on the pheromone person. So I wouldn't really recommend doing that just because it's too much work. But if you're in a 10-man and this person is dying, you can always do that. You could also potentially use your Rem glyph to force a Rem to try to jump out to them. Paladin is going to have a similar function to Mistweaver, although it doesn't have like the smart healing around itself. You do have like your LOD as SH and your EF as obviously EF. And generally speaking, what I would do is Radiance is 6-player capped. I would generally speaking be in the melee here, getting your Holy Power off meleeing the boss, and then just sending your LODs, your Radiances, your Eternal Flames into the melee, and then obviously keep your beacon on the Pheromone person. So those are the basics of how you should set up healing here. Really, the main question is whether or not you should use like D-Star or Rain or like F-Flow or whatever to heal this range stack. And mathematically speaking, Divine Star is like the most busted stacked up raid healing in 25-man. In 10-man, I'd probably take Cascade and do the Rain here or your F-Flow here. Whereas in 25-man, generally speaking, you just want like your Priest here, Divine Starring, and then you want your Shaman to either be putting their Rain here as well and just overhealing more and sending their filler on the melee, or if you're having your melee die, you probably want to be moving your Rain along the melee rather than having like a Cascade or Divine Starring into the melee. The big reason for this is that Divine Star is uncapped, whereas Healing Rain is capped at 6, along with basically every other AoE healing spell in the game is capped at 6 targets. So this concept of spreading our healing out so we're not all like healing into the same spot, right, and doing a bunch of overhealing, we want to have our healing look more like a Venn diagram where like, you know, I'm healing mostly range, you're healing maybe the melee, somebody else is healing the tanks. This is going to dramatically increase the efficiency of your healing composition, reduce your overhealing, which is going to let you drop healers quicker, it's going to let everybody parse better, and it's just, you know, it's going to make you not wipe, because instead of everybody just spamming healing into the range stack or whatever, you're going to have people healing all the different groups of players. This is a very useful concept to apply to basically every fight in the game, especially like the fights that are actually difficult for healing. So definitely something to get better at doing, is looking for opportunities to use each healer's toolkit in a way that complements the fight and complements the other healers in your composition. So that's the fight. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, if you learned something, send a like, subscribe, comment for the algorithm, etc. Yeah, thanks for watching again. See ya.